Good morning. I'd invite you to open your Bibles to Numbers chapter 20 will be where we begin in this lesson, Numbers chapter 20. It's not every year that the last day of the year is Sunday. And as people are thinking about the new year, I remember one of the New Year's resolutions I made when I was younger and punkier was that I'm never going to have another New Year's resolution again, and I've kept that resolution. The reason for that is that if something is worth doing, then start it now. Don't wait for a new year to get something started. But at the same time, I like the idea of having new goals for the next year, to set new opportunities that you want to try to attain in that year. I'm all for those kinds of ideas. And so trying to think about what I wanted to do this morning, I had a few ideas that I was going between and trying to figure out what I thought would be appropriate for this morning. And I want to talk about a theme that happens in Moses' life after things don't go the way that he may have expected them to go. Ask yourself this morning if your life is what you expected it to be. Are there certain things that you had hoped in, certain things that you thought you would have accomplished by now, certain things that you wish were different, and because they haven't turned out the way that you would have liked for them to turn out, you've struggled with how you've reacted to the dashed hopes that you have? I think one of the people that we can turn to in the Bible to see how we should react to disappointment is Moses. The life of Moses can be broken up into 3 trimesters. He lived till he was 120 years old. But the first period of Moses' life, the first 40 years when he was found in a basket in the river and he grew up in Pharaoh's household, seems to possibly have been getting groomed to be the next Pharaoh. The next 40 years is when he's in the land of Midian, after he had tried defending one of his fellow Hebrew slaves and didn't turn out the way that he wanted to in that moment. So he goes to Midian and he meets his wife at the well, like other men have met their wives at wells in the book of Genesis. I guess that's just the place that you go. And he's there for 40 years becoming a shepherd of sheep as God prepared him for his third 40 years, his third trimester. And the third trimester of Moses' life is the one that we probably know the most about. We're given the most information about it too. This is where you see the 10 plagues happening. This is where we have the Red Sea crossing. This is where God sends manna down from heaven. And so this is the section that we study the most because we have the most scripture about it. But I will say that there's parts of this last period in Moses' life that I haven't given enough attention to and thought to. And those are the last moments in the book of Numbers after he has sinned and after he's told that he can't come into the promised land. How does Moses live the rest of his life after his earthly hopes have been dashed? And that's what I want to look at in this lesson this morning. Let's start out, though, by thinking about the moment where Moses strikes the rock and he's told that he can't enter the land. And try to imagine what would be the emotions of Moses in this moment. Look starting in Numbers chapter 20 in verse 8. And this is the 6th of 7th complaints that the Israelites make against Moses and against the Lord in the book of Numbers from chapter 11 to chapter 21. There's 7 times that the Israelites complain. And this is the 6th of those 7 times. But look starting in verse 8 of Numbers chapter 20. Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. Now try to imagine what's happening here. Moses is told to take this staff. I take it that it's the staff that's budded or a couple chapters earlier, this perhaps same staff that's been used for these other miraculous events. Take this staff, and I want you to go up to this rock and tell the rock to bring forth water. A little different from Exodus chapter 17, by the way. The Israelites' time in the wilderness is bookended with water coming from a rock. The first time, Moses does indeed strike it and water comes from it. Do you remember what 1 Corinthians 10 says about the rock that followed them in the wilderness? It was Christ. And the rock in Exodus 17 was struck, and from that striking, blessings came from it. Does that sound like Jesus, who was struck? And because he was struck on the cross, blessings have flowed from him? Yes. But at the end of the time in the wilderness, Moses is now told, you tell the rock to bring forth water. And you imagine Moses gathering these Israelites, these people that have just been a bane to him for 40 years in the wilderness, complaint after complaint, all these times that he's been frustrated with them. They drove him to a point in Numbers chapter 11 to say, God, just take my life if I have to put up with these people. And so he gathers this congregation. And he uses some harsh words towards the people when he says, hear now, you rebels. I don't think he's saying that they're rebels to try to instruct them. I think he's letting off some steam when he says this. And he says, shall we bring forth water? As if I'm the one that's going to do this by my power. Shall we bring forth water for you guys? Psalm 106 verse 33 says about this moment, they made Moses' spirit bitter, and he spoke rashly with his lips. He's reached a tipping point here. And he raises up the staff. By the way, do you remember in Numbers chapter 15 where it talks about a high-handed sin? Moses just said it a few chapters earlier. A high-handed sin is the kind that's not going to be forgiven. And ironically, Moses lifts up his hand and he strikes the rock when he was told to speak to it. And even though he disobeys in this instance, God still gives enough water for all the Israelites and their livestock. Imagine the amount of water gushing from this rock. So the Israelites are taken care of in this moment, but then God turns to Aaron and Moses, and God has a decisive thing that he's going to say to them. That because you've disobeyed me, because you didn't believe in me like you should have in this moment, you're not going to enter the promised land. Have you ever wondered before, do you remember back in Numbers 14, when the Israelites are told that they're sentenced to 40 years total in the wilderness? And they're going to drop dead, every one of them in the wilderness, until the next generation rises up. And there's two exceptions, Joshua and Caleb. Have you ever wondered from Numbers 14 that it doesn't say that Moses is one of those exceptions? It's only Joshua and Caleb. I wonder if Moses, when he gave those words to the people, if he's just assuming that he would be an exception. But back in Numbers 14, it's only going to be Joshua and Caleb. And here we find out why Moses isn't going to go. As if God projected the future and knew what was going to happen in the future. But just imagine being Moses here. This one moment where you didn't handle your temper the right way. And all your life, you've been building up to this point of taking this assembly of Israelites into the promised land. You've sacrificed everything to get them to this point, and you're at the precipice of being there. And you have to go ahead and strike this rock and say some things that you shouldn't have said. What do you think that would feel like? In Deuteronomy, it says in Deuteronomy 3:23 and verse 25, and I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, please let me go over and see the land, the good land beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and Lebanon. Now, Moses does get to see it, but he says in this text, let me go over. Like, let me be in it, Lord. We don't get that recorded for us in the book of Numbers, but in this instance, Moses was pleading with the Lord, God, please let me go into the promised land. I've spent 40 years in the wilderness with these people, and they've driven me to a tipping point. And God says no. Are there things in your life that you wish were different? Things that you had put your hope in, but your hopes have been dashed. Maybe it's the state of the nation. Maybe since COVID and the lockdowns, and you've got concerns and complaints about the nature of the government. Maybe the thing that has been dashed in your life is the state of your family life. You wish by now that perhaps you would have been married. You wish by now that perhaps you would have had children. You wish by now that maybe you wish that you didn't have the family that you had. Whatever it might, people have got all kinds of reasons to complain. And maybe your hopes have been dashed in that way. Maybe the state of your retirement and your finances are not what you wish that they were. Maybe your physical health is not what you wanted it to be. The question that we have to ask ourselves as we compare our lives to Moses here is that Moses' earthly hopes have been dashed. Your earthly hopes may have been dashed. There might have been some things that you expected more out of in life. But the question for this lesson is, how are you responding to that? How are you reacting to that? Are you letting yourself become jaded and bitter? Are you letting yourself be so upset about everything that you wouldn't do anything else that the Lord has asked you to do? Because after all, I haven't been given the life that I want. And maybe one of the reasons I'm doing this today is because as we look at the new year and people think about starting over and stuff like that, you might think about some mistakes you've made this last year. You may not have handled everything the way that you wanted to. There may have been circumstances that kind of happened to you, and you didn't want those things to happen. Let this next year be a starting point, a restarting point. How does Moses handle himself after he's told decisively, "You won't go in, Moses"? The rest of the book of Numbers shows several times where Moses is still obeying God. And we could learn lessons from all these other things that Moses is told by God to do, and he goes ahead and does them, even though his earthly hopes have been dashed. But I want to isolate this to 4 instances where Moses, it says explicitly, Moses did as the Lord commanded. And just think about these 4 instances, what it was that he did in the backdrop of his hopes having been dashed. The first thing is in the same chapter, and that's that Moses still cared for other people in the midst of their grief, even though he had all kinds of reasons to grieve. Look at Numbers chapter 20 and start in verse 25. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son and bring them up to Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son. And Aaron shall be gathered to his people and shall die there. Moses did as the Lord commanded. Do you see the phrase there? And they went up to Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation, and Moses stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, and when all the congregation saw that Aaron had perished, all the house of Israel wept for Aaron 30 days. Numbers chapter 20 is a rough chapter for Moses and his family. At the beginning of the chapter, Moses' sister dies, and then at the end of the chapter, Moses' brother dies, and in between is when Moses and Aaron are both told that you're not going to enter the promised land. And so God is telling Moses to assist Aaron and Eleazar and go up this mountain, take the priestly robes off of Aaron, put them on Eleazar, and your brother is going to die up there. Do you think that would have been a hard moment for Aaron? He's been in the wilderness too for 40 years. He was with Moses during the 10 plagues, and now he doesn't get to enter the promised land either. And here's Moses, and I think part of this is a responsibility, a duty for Moses to be able to pass the torch on for the priesthood and all that sort of thing. But this is a difficult moment for Aaron, and Moses has just been told himself, you're not going to enter the land. Do you know what my temptation in a moment like this would be? Somebody is crying. Somebody's going through something difficult. Yeah. Well, I'm going through some difficult things too. And so why should I be there to help that person? I've experienced my own loss. And I understand that there are times that you've got to take time to heal and recover from that. But would you keep using that as an excuse to never help anybody else in the midst of their grief? Maybe somebody would say, you know what, I just need good vibes. I can't be around somebody else that's going through something difficult right now. I'm not going to bear their burdens. Maybe somebody would say, well, their sorrows are not as bad as mine. You know, after all, Aaron, you're not going to enter the promised land. I get that, but I've gone through more than you have, and I'm not going to be there to assist you because I've gone through much worse than you have. Then you just buck up and deal with it. By the way, do you want to know one of the ways that older people can sometimes do that towards younger people? You know, like when kids have their first puppy love? You know, they're like teenagers and they fell in love with somebody, and then it like lasted 2 weeks and they're crying about it. And an older person goes, oh, it's not a big deal. You think that's a big deal to those kids that happened to? You think sometimes older people can just brush off the difficulties of younger people? Whatever is difficult for you in your life context is difficult for you. And sometimes people can just brush off whatever it is that you're struggling with because they've been through more than you have. And look at Moses and how he's still dealing with Aaron and his difficulties. Do you think there's opportunities in this church? Even though you might have hopes that have been dashed, there's still opportunities for you to be able to help sick and shut-ins. There's opportunities for you to have weighty conversations, to listen to people and their difficulties. The truth is, in the Bible, that if you've been through trials and traumatic things in your life, you've been uniquely equipped to be able to help other people. In 2 Corinthians 1:4, Paul talks about the Lord who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. You know, the more a church suffers in a year, the more equipped that church has become to be able to help other people in the midst of their sorrows. But what Satan wants us to do with our sorrows and our failures is to just turtle up, just look inward and not look outward as to how this moment has trained me and helped me to be able to be helpful to other people. I can recall back to some of the times where people have had conversations with me when I was going through something difficult. And those people had all kinds of things that were difficult in their life as well. And those people had a tempered kind of wisdom because they handled it the right way. Notice, though, what else Moses does after his failure is he has a care for the success of future generations. Go over to Numbers chapter 27. In the context, this is when Moses is tasked with commissioning Joshua to be the next leader. But look at Numbers chapter 27, starting in verse 15. Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep that have no shepherd." God here is telling Moses that you need to appoint a guy that's going to go out and in among the people, go fight the battles for them. We'll say more about that in a little bit. Look at verses 22 and 23. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and made him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole congregation, and laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord directed through Moses. Moses does exactly what the Lord asks him to do. I want you to select the guy that's going to take your role, Moses, and I want you to wish good things for that man. I want you to go ahead and hope the best that this guy is going to lead them. And Moses, don't have anything in your mind that, I hope that he fails a little bit so everybody remembers how great I am. Nothing like that. Do you have a concern for the future generation? You might be thinking, well, what hope do I have the rest of my life? What am I going to have to do for anybody else ever to prepare other people? Think about the concern that we ought to have for children or grandchildren. The next generation of Christians. When people say the next generation of Christians are the children, I think that's partially true. The next generation of Christians would also be people who right now are adults but aren't in this room, and they're not Christians, because we should be evangelistic. But the concern for the next generation that we see in front of us, the children, parents, are you instilling the Lord in your children? Are you having conversations about the Lord with your children and how your children should act and react to all kinds of different things, training them to think about the Lord as they ought to? What about concern for young new Christians? One of the most important things that a local church can do is to properly embrace new Christians. As soon as they're out of the water, they're inviting that person to their house. They're rejoicing with that person. They're finding out their address so they can send them cards. They're getting their phone number so they can text them and talking to them about if there's anything that they need, we're here to help you, things like that. What about equipping future leaders? Getting men together and studying together about how to be godly leaders. If all of your earthly hopes were dashed, would you be so distracted by it that you would not have any concern for the next generation? You remember that time with King Hezekiah? And the Babylonians came and they wanted to see all the stuff that he had, and he gladly showed them all of the riches that I have. And he didn't tell them about the Lord. And because of this, look what happened. They're going to be judged by the Babylonians. He didn't handle that situation right. And in 2 Kings 20, verses 18 and 19, it says, "And some of your own sons who shall come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." By the way, that's the verse in the Bible people use to suggest that Daniel was probably made into a eunuch. That's what the Babylonians were going to do when they would take people into captivity. Oh man, that sounds really bad for my children and grandchildren. But then in verse 19, then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good." For he thought, why not, if there will be peace and security in my days? Learn the lesson of Hezekiah there. A good king overall that has this stain on his record. What are you doing to show concern for the next generation, for the people that are younger than you? We all need people older than us that can help us, but we also have opportunities with those who are younger than us to train them and equip them and help them. Are you so embittered at life that you're unwilling to do that? Notice the next thing is Moses' care for the joy of others. Look at Numbers chapter 29 and just look at verse 40, the last verse of Numbers chapter 29. "So Moses told the people of Israel everything just as the Lord commanded Moses." All right? In the context, what is it that Moses is telling everybody about? In chapters 28 and 29, Moses is giving additional instructions for the 7 feast days that the Israelites are going to have. When they come together in the Promised Land and they remember the Passover, and they remember Pentecost, and they remember the Day of Atonement, all of these great festivals that have so many blessings tied to them. And the Israelites were rejoicing at a couple of these. They're commanded to rejoice at some of these. It would be like if there was going to be some big party that you knew you didn't get to go to, but you were going to tell people what it was all going to be like. There's going to be the best food. Everybody's going to have a great, like family reunion in the Lord. It's a time where everybody who doesn't always get to see each other is going to be with each other 7 times during the year. If you couldn't go to that, what would your attitude be in telling people? Would that be FOMO, fear of missing out? I don't want to have to tell you about all these things that you're going to enjoy together that I won't get to be part of. And here's Moses telling them, these are the festivals that you're going to partake in together. These are the ways that you're going to remember the Lord together that I don't get to be part of. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians 1:24, "We work with you for your joy, for you stand firm in your faith." Paul looked at the way he served other people as, I want you to find joy in the Lord. This is what I work for, is so that you can eradicate the sin in your life, so that you can focus on the Lord and be fixated on His glory, and in so doing you find joy. Yeah, but what if I don't always have the hopes that I wanted? That's not even what Paul's ultimately working for. He's working for everybody to have the same joy in the Lord. But Proverbs 12:25 says, "Anxiety in a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad." I think I've told you guys this before, but I have one memory of my great-grandma. And her name was Burma. And we visited her at a nursing home one day, and she was sitting in a rocking chair by the window. And her back was arched, and she was just sitting there like this and barely could really say anything to her. I don't remember how old I was, but I remember leaving the nursing home, and I asked my mom, why was she sitting there like that? And she said, well, she has worried her whole life. And her whole life, she's always just sat down and worried about the kids and the grandkids and the great-grandkids. And that's just kind of her posture, and she just worries all the time. And that transferred to my grandma, and that transferred to my mom, and that transferred to me. You want to know the biggest struggles I've ever had in my life is worry. Well, you know what worry actually is? Worry is the overconfidence that you think you know how things ought to go. It's a form of arrogance. Things ought to go this way. Things ought to go that way. And I know, but God, in your providence, you're missing some of these things. So I'm going to stress and worry. And then here you've got this proverb that says, anxiety in a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad. You know how many times people who have had all kinds of excuses and reasons why they shouldn't have any joy in this life have taken time to pull me aside and said, Eric, you're worrying too much. Eric, you're assuming the worst about everything. And I could look at those same people and go, well, why aren't you doing that? Your life stinks too. But they have a different perspective. How many of you, if you lost some kind of earthly joy, would still really be concerned about putting a smile on somebody else's face? Or would you have the attitude of tearing people down? This is how I feel, and this is how everybody else ought to feel as well. You know, one of the greatest ways that we can care about the joy of other people is by helping people see the joy of the Lord by reaching the lost. I remember during the COVID lockdowns, when people lost their social connections, people were losing their jobs. And when I lived in Atlanta, that all happened when I was living in Atlanta. And I don't think there had ever been like an 18-month spurt of more evangelistic opportunities during that time. People that, even though you're not supposed to meet face-to-face, still wanted to meet face-to-face. Non-Christians in the community that had their hopes dashed, and they wanted to learn about the Lord. You know, all around you in your workplaces, in your schools, perhaps in your family, there are people who have had earthly hopes dashed, and we've got the message that can truly bring joy to other people. Are we willing to share that? The last thing that we see Moses doing, where we see the phrase, and Moses did as the Lord commanded, is used 4 times in Numbers chapter 31. But this is when Moses is fighting the Lord's battles. Look at Numbers chapter 31, starting in verses 1 and 2. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, avenge the people of Israel on the Midianites. Afterwards you shall be gathered to your people. All right, here Moses is told to go fight the Midianites. The Midianites had done some bad things to the Israelites in Numbers 25, and they're going to go avenge these people. And this becomes some of the territory that some of the tribes of Israel live in. Like, he's conquering some of the land that they'll eventually all live in, that he's not going to be able to partake in. But look at verse 7. And they warred against Midian as the Lord commanded Moses, and killed every male. In verse 31 and verse 41, it says the same thing about Moses doing what the Lord had commanded him to do. Can you imagine fighting these battles, conquering this land, knowing that you don't get to live in these places? Well, what's the point? You know, it's important that we as Christians know what our battles are that we're supposed to fight. Our battles are not to end world hunger. Our battles are not to elect some certain kind of government to be over us. Our battles are not to protect our physical health in every situation to the point of disobeying the Lord. Our mission, Ephesians 6:11, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Our mission is to fight against the battles that Satan tries to plot against us. He's got schemes. He's got a filing cabinet, and he knows all of your weaknesses. And sometimes we as Christians can get distracted and think, well, our mission is this political thing or this social thing, and our mission is to fight against Satan. The Bible teaches that sin has momentary pleasure. In Hebrews 11:25, Moses choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Are you the kind of person that's fighting those kinds of battles? Forsaken momentary pleasure because you know that you're going to be pleasing to the Lord if you do those things. You might have had all kinds of opportunities lost in this life, but if your perspective is, well, this didn't work out for me, that didn't work out for me, it's okay if I go ahead and just look this up online right now. It's okay if I go ahead and just let off some steam and show vengeance with my words towards this person right now, because what's the point anyways? Everything else is broken. And here Moses goes ahead and he fights the Lord's battles. I'm going to fight exactly how the Lord has asked me to fight. I'm not going to avoid these things. I'm going to do things the Lord's way, even to the end, because that's my biggest concern. Now, ask yourself the question, what would be in somebody's heart that they would still be concerned with the next generation and the care for the joy of other people and fighting the Lord's battles the way that God has asked you to fight them? What would cause somebody to still be concerned about those things when your earthly hopes are dashed? Remember Hebrews 11 when it talks about people that were looking to something beyond this life? Moses was told he was never going to enter the promised land. Was there a sense in which he did enter the promised land, though? Yeah? How about in the transfiguration? Remember in Mark 9, 2-4, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Now, do you suppose when Moses was in Abraham's bosom, for however long that was, he was just going, you know what? I think there's going to be this day when Jesus is going to be transfigured, and I'm going to show up on this mountain in the promised land, and then I'll finally have gotten there. All my hopes will finally be fulfilled. You think that was his perspective there? He's been in a much better place for a while. You want to know how we care about the right things even when your life is broken and your family is broken and your nation is broken and you've made mistakes that have invited some of these things. You want to know the kind of mindset that keeps serving the Lord no matter what and is concerned about the joy of other people and all these things that we've looked at, is that I have a hope beyond whatever it is in my life that's been dashed. And that hope drives me to be concerned for other people, to be concerned for the Lord. Moses eventually entered the promised land, but I suspect at this point it really didn't matter because he had found something much greater in the meantime. Is your hope set in that place with the Lord forever? And if it really is, you will still do what the Lord has asked you to do, no matter what frustrations and disappointments this life has brought to you. We're about to sing the song, Prepare to Meet Thy God. What Moses was doing, even towards the end of his life, after he knew he couldn't enter the promised land, is he was preparing to meet his God. He had a perspective that was beyond this life. If there's anybody here this morning that needs to adopt that perspective, or you've lost that perspective and it's caused you to make more and more mistakes in your life, this is an opportunity to reset. This is an opportunity to make some new goals for the next year. If there's anybody here that needs to repent and get their life right with God, please come forward while we stand and while we sing.